I'm Teresa Acuña. I'm the Associate Director, Democracy Programs over at the Ash Center. I'm lucky enough to run the Tech and Democracy Fellow. That's 6 individuals, technologists, people working in the space at an intersection of democracy, politics, and technology. And this year, we're lucky to have Victoria McCullough from Tumblr join us as a fellow. And so these workshops are part of the series of part of their experience as a fellow here at the Ash Center. They come and they give us the insights of what they do day to day. So I'll start with a few housekeeping items. This session will be recorded, so that's just for your own knowledge. Also, I invite you next Tuesday, same time, same place. We're going to have Sophia Gross, another Tech and Democracy Fellow from Snapchat, talking about product design and product building over in the Snap team. Anything else? I think that's it. Yeah. So without further ado, here's Victoria.
Awesome.
Welcome.
All right, thank you. I'm glad I don't have to have a mic so I can wave my hands as much as possible while I'm here. Thank you for allowing me to be here. A couple of things I just wanted to start with, and some things that I think I've been thinking about, and a little bit about how I got to this role at Tumblr, and I think really what drove a lot of my passion for being in this space that we'll talk about today. So after I graduated college, undergrad in 2007, I started off as a community organizer for then Senator Obama's campaign. So I got my start sort of working with people, registering people to vote. I'd grown up in Tennessee, gone to school and college in Tennessee, and then moved to Iowa to work in the caucuses for 2008. And really just, I think, to be honest, as I was coming out of undergrad, and as many of you who may have just recently left undergrad know, oftentimes you don't know what you're going to do after that point, and you're still asking a lot of questions. But it was really one of the best experiences I think I've had at really understanding how communities connect online. And in the case of the 2008 election, this was Howard Dean's campaign had really started to utilize digital tools, but the Obama campaign really started to leverage the power of the digital community and really getting people to activate offline. And we use them as field organizers, but ultimately the digital tools were meant to really drive that conversation, that connection online, or drive that connection offline. So getting people really watching the moment that people maybe met each other or didn't know that their neighbor or their teacher was an Obama supporter, and finding ways to go volunteer at the local office or go knock doors. But it was really sort of, I think, I look back at that now as sort of this really pivotal moment in my own life, and I think for a lot of us who worked on the campaign, as a moment in which we saw how powerful digital tools and the internet could be at really making people, helping people connect. And that was something that I think has really stayed with me, and is something that I'll get into a little bit later when we dive in to some of the exercises, but it's something that I think I'm left now with bigger questions about how digital and real life really play a role, and how they each shape each other, and how all of those factors influence how people ultimately act. So I worked after the campaign. I had a really great mentor who was like, "Oh, campaigns are so awesome, but you really need to know what it's like to work in government. You need to understand what that's like." So many of us in the case, I think there were ultimately hundreds of us, flocked to DC, lived on some couches, ate a lot of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, did not make hardly any money. But I ended up, my mentor, who was the same person who said, "You should move to DC, you should couch surf," ended up getting a role, appointed to a position at Department of Homeland Security and in Congressional Affairs. So ended up, she asked me to come and work for her, but it was this really sort of awesome first role, working in government and really understanding not only how government interfaced with policy, but more importantly, how we were interfacing with Congress. And in the case of Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security actually has over 22 agencies that they have to report to Congress on. So it was this also sort of a second great lesson in, I think, understanding how difficult, what a role communication plays in really educating your audience. And in the case of Congress, that was always sort of an uphill battle, as we had anything from immigration conversations to Secret Service to sort of many of the challenges that I think we're actually still seeing play out today. And then after that, I actually worked, got a chance to, when the Deepwater Horizon oil spill happened in 2010, this was about at the end of my position at Homeland Security. This now feels like ages ago. I don't know for any of those of you who sort of remember what that was like. But I was still working in Congressional affairs and was asked to actually go down. And this was at the time when they thought, if y'all remember this, they were like, "Oh, we'll cap it in 2 days. Like they're gonna figure this out. It'll be fine, but we really need people on the ground serving as sort of liaisons to the community and helping make sure that everyone is getting what they need. Because this feels very similar to what happened. We don't want the things that happened during Hurricane Katrina to really happen with this oil spill." And so I took a carry-on, and what ended up being 2 weeks ended up turning into 6 months down there. But it was, yet again, sort of this really incredible in-person, on-the-ground opportunity to see, one, how internet digital communities were really playing a role at shaping the narrative that people were hearing down there, but also how important it was for people not to just have a person who was sort of speaking at them from DC and sort of speculating about what their experiences were or what they actually needed, but more importantly, being on the ground and really trying to hustle to get what they needed. And I look at that now as sort of one of the most, next to the campaign experience being one of the most important experiences in really kind of understanding the role that how government really needs to get out in the field often. And I feel like I see that need a lot today. And then finally, right before Tumblr, I ended up moving into the White House as working in the Office of Public Engagement. Our mantra there was we were trying to make the White House the people's house. We wanted everyone from faith groups to groups who were working on immigration to healthcare. We ultimately were the office that were sort of designed to do that outreach and communicate with all the groups that could either, one, help support the Obama administration's policies, but really leverage all of the tools and the assets that the government had to really deliver for in-person for community. So I think by the end of the administration, we had so many people come through who I think, one, may have never really imagined coming through, but that idea of that real connection between the president, the administration officials, and people who really understood what these policies meant on the ground, having that direct connection, facilitating that, you saw sort of the power of seeing how that input really shaped policy. And then I left the administration after however many years, really, or after about 5 years, when I was just I remember having a moment where I was looking at the calendar of events and thinking, this should be so exciting, but I'm so tired and so exhausted, like someone else should come in and really do this. And so I ended up leaving and had wanted to live in New York for a while and moved there, working with a friend of mine, and stumbled into this job that I'm in today. I will say, I think, I'm making all these connections about sort of what led me here, what made me excited about this role, working in social impact and public policy, but it's not something I had planned. And so I think for any of you who are looking at this space, I think that I am incredibly passionate about social impact and ultimately having businesses really have that compass that's driving their practices, that's driving how they, in our case, treat our users, work with other businesses. That part is sort of what drove me. And then the technology piece and the social media piece was something that kind of came after. And I always want to be transparent about that. I think it wasn't something that was super intentional on my part, but I was really being driven by sort of more of this passion for working with people. And in the case of Tumblr, I had found that these digital communities were so powerful online at really shaping people's identities, especially young people, young activists. Were getting a lot of their information, a lot of their education from Tumblr, and that part really drew me in. And in this, the role that I'm in today is both public policy and social impact, which is a little bit rare. I think there are a couple of other platforms that sort of have it that way. In most cases, whether you're talking about the big places like Facebook or Google, they often have sort of much bigger teams. But given Tumblr is more of a medium-sized platform, we have a bit of a smaller team, but I found that sort of social impact and public policy are often like can be very, very intertwined because we are on the social impact side, similar to what I mentioned earlier with sort of previous roles. You're constantly taking in input from other groups, whether you're, in the case of Tumblr, like our social impact issues are, and areas of focus are mental health, LGBTQ conversations, inequality, and racial justice. So those are the three sort of big umbrellas. So we're constantly talking to groups who are using our platform, telling us what what's working, what's not working, and that conversation I think ultimately is driving like how we're really thinking about the next frontier. What are the next products, the next features that we can really dive into and think about to create the best possible user experience. So with that, I just wanted to do, for those of you who aren't super familiar with Tumblr, I just wanted to walk through a few things on Tumblr and just explain some of the features that I think are actually interesting and unique compared to other platforms. There are also some of the features that I'm interested in exploring with you today because I think they might be some solutions to some of the problems that we're seeing or some of the I hate to say problems, challenges. I'll be sort of careful about that. I think challenges that we're seeing on social media platforms. So I want to walk through that, and then really dive into some of the things that I've been thinking about, and I have a feeling a lot of you have been thinking about. The title of this sort of workshop is really around driving solutions and the fact that most of the platforms have really been driven on things like freedom of expression, building community, but at the same time we're running into, in our case in the States, but I think it's very much global, but running into challenges with user safety and like whether or not those things actually conflict. And I think I bring this to y'all because my hope is that as we dive into this fellowship, and one of the reasons I think I was hoping to do this with y'all at the beginning of the year is that I'm still asking a lot of these questions myself, and I think a lot of my counterparts are asking these questions, but the hope is that through some of the conversations today, maybe allowing y'all to sort of put yourself in the seat of some of the folks on technology teams, that we can maybe start to ask some of those questions. So that's kind of a little bit of the first part. So I'm just going to run through just a little bit about Tumblr, and I'm not going to get into all of this. This is our main mission. Tumblr is where your interests connect you to your people. That is what we have found. Most folks really come to Tumblr because they're either really into comics or anime or K-pop. There are Taylor Swift. There's a lot of T Swift fans. And they're often being driven instead of, I think, where you see in other places where maybe they're looking for Twitter just for their news or Facebook to connect with friends. What we found on Tumblr is that most people are coming because they're looking for communities. And this is a big thing. So one of the key features on Tumblr is that your user count is not visible. It's one of the reasons I think mental health and LGBTQ rights has become a big part of a big mission for us, is that I think early on people were coming not because they wanted to be seen necessarily, seen publicly, but more that they wanted their inside self to be expressed. And in the case of the LGBTQ community 10 years ago, where a lot of places required you to be public, Tumblr was one of the few places that allowed you to be anonymous. And so I think I always use the example as someone who I grew up in a really rural area in Tennessee, and if you're in a rural area where there are a few resources and you might not actually think that you know someone who is gay or who is Muslim or who maybe shares some of these passions, connecting on that interest and on that identity can really be powerful. And that's something that community, in the case of the LGBTQ community, has been such a really a community that's driven a lot of our social impact and ultimately really driven, I think, a lot of the activism that we've seen on Tumblr the last several years. So these are just some of the breakdowns of the different communities that we see on the platform. I don't think things differ too much from what you would see in other places. I will say, I'll call out the arts community is another one that really drives a lot of the expression on the platform, and that's something that we always have an eye towards. Gaming is becoming increasingly popular. I mentioned K-pop has sort of this really wild following on the platform, and we have a remarkable user base growing in South Korea as a result of that. And that with K-pop has come lots of infusion of the Korean culture onto the platform, and that's been sort of really fascinating to watch. Same with comics and anime. That's another place where we see activism come out. When we talk about gender equality, those are some of the communities that aren't just limited to those specific topics, but you find other ways to really express political views or any sort of activism. These are just some general numbers. One really important thing to point out, and I think is driven also a lot of our social impact. Tumblr is, I think that number is slightly outdated, so a little over 80% of our user base is under the age of 34, and then we're seeing sort of an increasing amount of use between ages of 14 and 24, so that Generation Z, who is, again, being very, reminds me very much of the LGBTQ community. They're driving a lot of these activism conversations in a way that we saw with millennials, but I think we're seeing in a much different way, and that's the community that age group is often driving a lot of our politics and policies. So some of this is just, I'm going to run through really quickly because you don't have to, I want to show you a couple of things on the dashboard just for those of you who aren't on the platform. This is what that looks like. And then it mostly has become a publishing platform. So for many people, they use it as a journal, as a diary, as a place to put their sketches. So it has really become a place purely to sort of create. In my case, just reblog other cool people doing interesting things because I'm not as much of a creator, but I think you have a lot of people coming on looking for that kind of content. But most of our work is really geared towards publishing anything from poetry to artwork, and these are just some of the things. And GIFs are, of course, very popular. And I think this is the other thing, and we do this also as a platform. We just there's a little bit of a tone that I think we've taken, and I'll talk about a little bit about this when we talk about community guidelines. But these are just some of the things that we encourage our own users to think about. And it's this idea of really bringing your true self to the platform, and I think bringing a level of authenticity to whatever you're creating. And then in turn, I think as a team, we have a Tumblr staff blog that also does this. So anytime we're announcing feature changes or community guidelines changes, we're really sort of pushing people and ourselves to sort of share that voice and be casual, conversational, authentic, and transparent. And I think those are a lot of things that have ultimately sort of driven how we talk to our user base. Visuals, always, I think they're now good with every platform. And then I want to just talk really quickly about the reblog. This is another thing that I think is, I will say Tumblr we're not perfect. We still see, I think, a lot of, like you would on any platform, cyberbullying, trolling, but I don't think we have seen it to the level of intensity as other platforms. And the reblog was something that our founder, David Karp, really pushed on and wanted to maintain. And it was this idea that you can't go to other Tumblr blogs and just do these fly-by-the-night comments, kind of like what you see in the comment section of online news platforms. This was meant to be a place that if you decided to troll me, that you were going to be forced to own that as a blog, and you're going to have to reblog that to your own blog and then sort of write your comments. And it meant that people who were going to troll often really had to own being a troll, which most people, I think, it discouraged a lot of those who were like, at least made them think twice about it. But the reblog also meant that discourse, like on these really complicated topics, like school to prison pipeline, or larger topics just around race and unconscious bias. It meant that we often saw these really long threads of people basically taking a post, writing their return, and then someone else reblogging it. So I wish I had some examples. It would be too long to show, but I can share those with the group. But there were some of these really powerful reblog chains that were on anything. In my case, I focus on the ones that are social impact, but it also could have been anything on like a Captain Marvel is like the recent thing, but on a particular CW show, and whether or not a character should have been interested in this other character. Like there are these really long conversations on what it might seem menial, but for the platform that is really driven on passions, it just meant that people were able to really expand their mind on certain issues that they didn't necessarily, they may have had a different opinion going in. So that reblog is something, in addition to the anonymous factor, that I feel like has really played a powerful role in shaping how activism, a lot of folks from certain roles talk about cisgender. Is everybody familiar with that term, cisgender? I feel like I'm in a space that would know what cisgender is. It's not always the case. But often people will say Tumblr was the place that coined that term. Or they'll say that Tumblr is the first. A lot of people who are later maybe looking at Tumblr from a social science perspective, like talk about how Tumblr users were the first to know what heteronormative meant and use it very liberally in conversation. So it kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of how I think that reblog function really how it evolved, and then how it ultimately ended up educating some of the folks on the platform and really helped shape identities.
Sorry, could you just repeat the part about how reblogging deters trolls?
Oh yeah, so it meant, and this is sort of my take on it. We've looked at this, we have a few examples of this, but the reblog, when you are looking at someone's post, often if you want to get on and like actually comment underneath, you have to reblog that to your blog first, reblog that to your blog first and then comment. So it made it just a little bit more difficult for you to just troll people and make comments, make negative comments. Again, I will say no, that doesn't stop people. I will explain why later. But I think it has been a little bit of like an obstacle for people, if that makes sense. It's a little bit like that interstitial that's like, are you sure you want to go here? Like, do you really want to do that? And I think the reblog has functioned. Does that explain it? Mm-hmm. And then this is just some of the analytics that you'd see on the back end. And yeah, so that's a little bit of the basics about Tumblr. I mentioned the three things I wanted to just wrap up on, because I do think they kind of lead into a little bit of our sort of the next half. But the reblog, the anonymous factor. The anonymous factor is interesting because we're seeing a lot of countries who are asking, they want to remove the option to be anonymous. Not as much in the United States, but the UK and other places are really wanting to remove that. And I think we are strong. That's been the one factor that I think our boss, our CEO, has really been adamant. And you can imagine, I'm not just talking about an LGBTQ kid in rural America, but I'm talking about the political dissident who is in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia, and that the ability to be anonymous and still share your views, I think, is so powerful, and that's ultimately been a factor that shaped us. And then the third piece, just to put a point on it, is the no visible public follower count. I think we're seeing that a lot today, that you have so many people, and I think we're all there. But is when you post something and you kind of crave like those views, and you crave the like a button, and you really want that. We've often heard people say that as a result of all of these features, that many users talk about the other platforms being an expression of their outside selves, their public self, and Tumblr being more of a reflection of who they are on the inside. And I think those are some of the key features that have played a role in really shaping that. So with that, to get Tumblr and a little bit of my background out of the way, I want to get to like the real, like juice of this whole problem and a lot of stuff I've been thinking about, and what I'm hoping will guide the next year, but again, where I'm hoping to get some of your help and insight. So I want to talk through a little bit about what we've been seeing in the news lately and some of the politics, and then we'll do, and Teresa, you need to help me if I'm not good on time, because I want to kind of cover this first, and then hopefully we can come back and like actually dig into more of the exercises. But a few things that I think have shifted my role in really in the last 2 years. When prior to the November 2016 election, public policy was super important, and I think we were getting all sorts of incoming from all over the world around like what is and is not allowed on certain platforms. But something that like became a real catalyst after the November 2016 election was the emergence of fake news. And whether or not, how that shaped the election. And ultimately, I kind of look back at that as a point when people really started to realize that even if you were not a social media user, what was happening on Facebook still impacted you. And I'll use Facebook as an example, but it was all of us had different examples of this, but Facebook, I think, often took the heat for a lot of it. But it was the first time that I think people actually realized that what was happening on Facebook was no longer staying on these social media platforms. And ultimately, what was, though that type of behavior, the type of conversation was shaping the conversation in the public square and with just the public generally. What was okay, what was not okay. It ultimately meant, in the case of civics and voting in the states, that it may have really shaped an election and is continuing and has a lot of power to shape our politics here and really globally. So look at that as like one example as things really started to evolve. Because I work at Tumblr, I have to have gifts for everything. So I felt like this is what I couldn't do live, but we felt this from our user base, and I think that a lot of folks were trying to figure out how do we respond to that. And what do we do to sort of prevent that? And ultimately, it was just a really difficult task. And I don't know, and I think everyone would say, we still haven't totally figured that out. So I look at that as like one really sort of big reflection point. And then Charlottesville happened. Again, more memes. These were just some popular, I like just looked up some of the things, and these were just some of the more things that had really driven around Tumblr around that day, or in the aftermath of Charlottesville. But Charlottesville, I look at as one of the biggest catalysts for basically every platform got into their meeting rooms and figure out what are we doing about this? Like how do we potentially had a role in really shaping a lot of this conversation. Are we doing enough to remove hate speech? Are we doing enough to really combat a lot of this negativity? And then ultimately, are our tools being used to organize these types of things? Like, and where do people go if we don't allow this type of behavior? Where are they going after? And then how the heck do you begin to police that? And this was like such. I just feel like I remember after like everyone. I talked to a lot of our counterparts across a lot of other platforms, and everyone sort of views that as sort of this big, even though a lot of us had been working through many of these issues around content moderation, this really is when hate speech became a more common term, and this idea of how this really bigger conversation around how platforms and social media really played a role. So that's one, or the second one. And then more recently, Alex Jones and InfoWars. We had an interesting example, and this is all public, but this was just about a month and a half ago. Things are sort of flying by. I think this was about 6 weeks ago, when Alex Jones was obviously sort of a known entity for a really long time, and then things sort of hit a point a few weeks ago when there was lots of calls for Twitter to remove him after some of his, especially hateful comments. And then once he got banned from there, we had this, I was sitting next to our social media person in a meeting, and she looked to me and she's like, oh my gosh, like InfoWars just started following us on Twitter. I was like, oh, that's so interesting. What's he doing? And then literally within 20 minutes, we see a tweet go up from Alex Jones that says something, and I wish I should have actually put a screenshot of that up, which is like, they will take away my Twitter and Facebook, but they will never take away my Tumblr. He was basically just like begging, like, just like asking us to really look at it. And we're really, was such a tough moment for us, because he was basically calling us out, admitting sort of that he had contributed all these things that had been said, all these things that he sort of talks about within his podcast, that it was sort of inviting us to figure out whether or not, he violated our guidelines. And so we had a moment internally where we ultimately had to decide, does what is living on his Tumblr, he had a couple of different accounts, but what does that do? Like, do we, even though some of that isn't necessarily the same type of behavior that he's exhibiting on Twitter or Facebook, does that still make it okay for him to live on Tumblr, especially when Tumblr has espoused being a safe space, especially for marginalized communities? We are also over 35% non-white, so a lot of our work is very much geared towards communities of color, and a lot of the people that he was really targeting. So we ultimately, brought his account down and notified him. What was one of the fascinating things is that we did bring him down, but we have sort of this fascinating article where Tumblr users, instead of saying that Tumblr brought him down, they take a lot of the credit for actually running him off Tumblr, which is sort of a fascinating thing. And another factor, I think, in thinking about this larger conversation is that users on many platforms, and I think Tumblr is unique, a little bit unique in this way, but they often self-police. In this case, it wasn't actually accurate, but I love the fact that they sort of feel like we did not want him here. We organized ourselves and we ran him off. And I think that that was just an interesting insight into how users can really galvanize around a lot of this. But Alex Jones is still sort of, I think this is going to be viewed as one of these inflection points for a lot of us, because I still don't think we have answers to Alex Jones. Like, I still don't know that someone described him as, I actually think we had this in one of our conversations here, he's someone who is maybe yelling sort of hateful speech, but he's also, it's the equivalent of maybe yelling fire in a crowded building. Like, there's some very, very dangerous implications, but I still don't think we've quite figured out how to address him. So with that, before we break, a few things I just wanted to talk about. Now that we're talking about how all of these points that have kind of led to this, I wanted to give you a little bit of insight, because this is one of the things that I do not think is talked about enough publicly, is all the things that go into making the safest possible user experience. I'm convinced that almost all the platforms are truly, truly invested in making users safe and delivering the type of experience that they sign up for. But it is incredibly difficult, especially for the Facebooks of the world, who are 1 billion and counting, or more than that. And it's just incredibly difficult to police all that. So just to give you a little bit of insight, essentially when we talk about generating a new community guidelines update or even a new feature, it's trust and safety. Trust and safety teams are basically the first line of fire. They're the ones who, when content is flagged by a user, or potentially maybe in the gray area for like an automated, like an AI flag, they will ultimately be the ones who determine when something's removed, when something is suspended, or that it stays up. And they are part of the process that actually communicates that. They are I think they are just so critical to all of this, and their work is something I think that needs to be applauded, but also is extremely taxing. Have many of y'all read about sort of the latest with trust and safety teams, about the mental health toll? There are a couple of interesting pieces that I'll send to you, but one of the things that I think is really evolving in this trust and safety space is the level, the types of content that are being put in front of them, and they're being asked to decide whether or not something is bad, whether or not something actually breaks like guidelines, could be bad for other users, and really asking a lot of these questions. The stuff that they're seeing, you can imagine, like, we all have guidelines now for gore, mutilation, child pornography, any like type of pornography, terrorist content, beheadings. They're like really, all of that, we'll look a little bit more into the community guidelines pieces, but the reason Facebook's is actually, I think, super interesting because they get very detailed, and the reason they get detailed is because their trust and safety team has seen all of that content. That is, I think, just, they are often, I think trust and safety is in a place where that will be a role that people are required to be heavily trained, but also require a lot of support and mental health support. They require breaks, and it's just an incredibly taxing role. And I think it's something that I'm hoping a role that becomes as time evolves and the public gets more aware of the role that they play in this conversation, because we will always need humans, I think, to moderate a lot of this content. And it will be, I think, its own industry, and something that I think there are a lot of organizations that are really looking at how you organize trust and safety agents, how you train them properly, and more importantly, how you demand technology companies give them all the support that they need, whether you're talking about, again, I think support around some of the psychological toll that they have to, that they take on, but they are just the most critical. So I mentioned them first here. And then, sorry, go ahead.
So the question was, is your team global? Because I'm guessing those policing things.
Yes, yeah, it
more
varies.
cultural than.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that, but yes, so our team, the main team is based in the United States because we're a U.S. to the world team, but in the case of when you're talking about translators or having someone who needs to translate certain content, we have teams across the globe. And then a lot of times that work, in the case for all of us, can be outsourced. Like there are a lot of groups that sort of work with us to take on that volume. And I think that's really the case for a lot of platforms as well. The other piece of this is engineering and product. And I think also underneath this, you can look at this as like a form of AI moderation. So when we're talking about content moderation, it's not just this idea of human moderation, but where there's actually technology that is not perfect, far from perfect, I would say, but is actually designed. It's especially being used, I think, mostly around terrorism content. They've gotten really sophisticated at being able to identify that and remove that pretty quickly. In other places, it's a lot harder. You can imagine hate speech you probably would never want that to be something that's entirely in the hands of AI. Because there are just so many challenges. But the engineering and product team is really who we work with to kind of really test out when we're determining like, oh, we need a significant, we need help and we can't do this all with humans, but like let's actually identify tools that we can leverage that flag that content or at least help us prioritize it for our trust and safety team. And it's usually some combination between human moderation, those trust and safety teams, and the AI products that we work with our engineering team. And their engineering team, beyond just identifying other technology, they're also helping us create things like we use this with self-harm. So if you go on Tumblr right now, don't do it. Don't test me on this. But I feel like this will be like the worst thing. But if you look for like pro-ana content, so any anorexia content or any sort of self-harm term, you typically have an interstitial that'll pop up that says like, hey, are you feeling okay today? Here's a group that you can go to. And our engineering team is often like, will help us develop different products to basically make, if we can't remove that content entirely, how can we put resources in front of our users before they actually get to that content? So those are some of the things they'll help with. Yeah.
If for a lot of the trust and safety, if the filtering is on a very like piece of media level, or if there's any sort of aggregate tracking of events, like I'm thinking of the Pizzagate example that happened on Twitter, when you start to see, and for Tumblr, I remember reading about the whole like Sherlock situation, and like if you can start to see more longitudinal trends and like be able to flag which ones are more malign.
Yes, yeah. There's between trust and safety, and then our community support team will usually be the front lines of that. So the community support team is often like maybe spam is being flagged, but they'll often get that stuff first. So they'll typically at the end of, in the end of a quarter, they're often able to sort of make ourselves, but also the technology slightly a little bit smarter to be able to tell that. I still would say it's not perfect, but I think there's hope that we can identify some of those trends, or even if we notice in the case of self-harm content, we're able to track. There's often coded terms being used, so those communities are incredibly agile and in the way that they use certain terms, and when they realize they're being flagged, they'll often go underground and use different terms, and I think community support is often the place to sort of identify some of those trends, and then we can set policies around it. And then the public policy team, so we're the ones sort of helping take an input from whether it's freedom of expression groups, working with the community support and trust and safety team to ultimately just try to develop really good policies that can be applied evenly and fairly, and ultimately trying to be the sort of the convener of all of these outside and internal dynamics, and trying to bring them all together to write some of those policies. And then there's always your legal team, who usually is trying wants to keep you being responsible and averting any sort of risk, and then ultimately is making sure that we're asking ourselves the right questions. But those are all the things that sort of are driving every content moderation change, every community guideline change that I think you're seeing. They're often the people that are in the room who I think you could imagine some version of this. This is the version of the war room. I think after Charlottesville, all of these groups, including CEOs and C-suite groups, really getting in a room, being like, how are we going to actually approach this? How are we going to handle this? I think, how do we feel about a break right now?
Yeah.
Does that work for y'all? And then I want to kind of end with this. This is just sort of the foundation. And then when we come back, I'll actually want to dig in a little bit with doing a little bit of this trust and safety exercise work. And I want to warn y'all just before we do break, I was telling these guys, a lot of this stuff is very explicit. So we're going to focus on hate speech. There's a lot of content that can be flagged, but I wanted to focus on hate speech because that seems to be, I think, the thing that is most difficult. So I want to warn, if any of you are not comfortable with that, I want to just make sure that you're aware that when we come back, I will show you a few sort of examples that are a bit sensitive. But yeah, let's take a break. How long?
Yeah, let's do like 10 minutes. There's some coffee, water outside.
That's my battery life.
You can do that.
Does that work?
Just so it's not like picking over a conversation. Okay, this is great. Those are great foundations. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Hi.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
I'm really interested in everything that you're working on. So for some context, I'm a student at the School of Design and Engineering.
Oh,
I also focus on this topic for my master's thesis.
Yeah.
It's been really hard getting any support at the design school because they just care about buildings. But
yeah. But this is so, we were literally, this is a friend from Spotify, and he's for the product side. He might be a good person for you to talk to. We were just talking about how critical this piece is to this conversation.
And I used to be a UI UX designer, so I was actually wondering like
Yeah, I am. I don't leave until tomorrow at 5. If you want to grab, we have some stuff in the morning, but like we're if you want to meet up, and then my email's at Victoria@tumblr.com. If you want to shoot me a note, we can always catch up afterwards. Hey, yeah, how's it going, Victoria? Ori, and then we didn't get to meet earlier. Marta, nice to meet you. Yeah. How's it going? You have to leave, I think, right?
Exactly.
So, okay,
no,
yeah.
but it's so interesting, and I believe like I get as well. Just hard
Yeah.
to watch or something.
Yeah, okay, awesome.
There are a lot of people.
Yeah.
Hopefully it is. I haven't tested this out on anyone, so y'all are like my first. But I find I kind of nerd out on it, so I'm kind of curious to see. I feel like y'all are sort of the perfect group to sort of figure out.
that's
like,
a really
oh,
interesting
there's like
concept
there's a lot here. Like people just don't talk about it that much for a lot of reasons. This is a really good group to, I think, just get some ideas. I'm also hoping y'all can help me figure out what the heck I'm gonna write about or study. That's the other thing, because I think there's so many questions
Yeah.
that I'm not just trying to figure out like where to start, basically. So, yeah. What are y'all working on or focusing on?
So we're doing like a thesis project, basically the equivalent of a thesis here at Kennedy School. And it's related to technology to enable participation in legal making process.
What was your name?
Oh,
Jenny.
Yeah.
Okay.
And one of
Are you very
manifestations of that,
involved
at least
in
Spain
this
and
topic as
Madrid,
well, or
is this
just
platform
organizing these
called
events?
Citizen
No, I mean,
Madrid,
so
Yeah.
built on this like
we make
open
sure
source
that
software
we're
that they're
building
sharing
out,
with a lot of other
this
cities, and
this
the idea is that like
well, that's your faculty
platform and you comment and discuss
So
it,
we've been
and
doing this
it's like sort of like change.org.
Yeah,
So
But
it's a lot.
very
it's
close.
institutional, and basically when the proposals reach a number of votes, the
It's
council,
more
the
of a
city
facility
council
also.
has to debate it.
Oh, yeah, I've read about some of this stuff.
So
Okay,
yeah,
I really
it's being
love that.
replicated
Yeah,
in many
But
places,
then
and
also
they're
just trying to
and
create
basically the
a
part
place
of the
for,
project where we're working on is now they are
in
trying to
exchange
develop
of,
metrics
what
of
can be
what
done
is
with
like
these
basically
patterns.
I think it's quite
Especially
broad
from a
so
policy
far, but they are
standpoint,
trying
someone
to
who's
develop metrics of
policy
how
is,
to like create this platform, but also like all the
legislators
participation
consider
strategies that that
none of
the
this is
city
happening
government is
so
putting
much.
out. How are they impacting
It is
the quality of lawmaking? Like in
yeah.
many
So it's
cases,
more of like trying
they
to educate the
feel like
policy folks here.
there's a
of
problem
what this
of
looks
like
like.
engagement, but also a problem
really needs to be a
of
fruitful
like we don't really know. Like
I was
it's
actually
kind of
wondering
a
if you knew
very
anyone that was
field in
in
the
the
sense of
space of,
how is this impacting not only in terms of
or
legitimacy,
even
but
just
are we
more,
are we actually tapping on collective intelligence?
Yeah.
Like are we making the best of?
Yeah, that's so interesting, because this is kind of one of the things I'm hoping we can talk about at the end, and I would love this to be a big conversation. I think there's got to be an element of this with these platforms, like that they're actually being asked to sort of actively be involved. It would be interesting to see if there are ways to think about, because I think this is going to have to be the new iteration of everything. It's like our users are going to have, it's like being like having driver's license. It's like there's a level of responsibility that I think you take on, whether you're, in this case, you're sort of pointing at, it sounds like government officials and sort of policy making. And I have to think that there's got to be some version of that for social media in terms of having active participation or upvoting or something that's like, hey, this was a shitty post, but it doesn't exactly like violate guidelines. You know?
I don't know how to.
Yeah,
No.
I would love to talk about this. Yeah.
How
Yeah.
do you do that in like a democratic way, even if you don't have for
We have an affiliation
Yeah.
of this actual cohort, but
But
she's
the other
not working
part of
on
it is we're also interested
hers is more
in
on
the work that
participation,
you do.
organizing.
Yeah.
I'm curious if Tumblr has a sense of
I will be the best person to contact Facebook, but at the very least, we have amazing.
So, yes, but not in the way that I think I would love to, but we typically, between our trust and safety teams, between community support team, people who are basically front lines of like, here's what's not working on the platform. They are often, and I think I would love to like actually analyze some of their data, but they do that themselves, so they can kind of tell. They can often tell like when something is trending, when there's like a spam bot. In our case, it might be like a pornography spam bot or something, but they're able to sort of identify that piece of it, so what's not working well. And then I think from the health of the platform, like when you can tell, like Twitter, like I have a feeling, you know, but you know, I have a feeling you can look at Twitter and you would argue not a health, like that is kind of inspired. Like if there's a certain point that's like not reaching like a healthy level in terms of if you were to use like constructive dialogue as a measurement, or the term of hateful words, like we're able to kind of see that, and I think our trust and safety team would see that. We've also worked, there's actually actually a group that started out of MIT. It would be interesting, I think, for y'all to talk to. It's called Coco. It initially was, KOKO. Their founders like generated out of MIT Media Lab, and I can't remember how it evolved, but they focus on mental health. So they were developing around like a chatbot, but to get to that chatbot, they develop a classifier that can allow them to identify content on a platform, like maybe users who are in crisis. They have to base it on a measurement around the health of the platform. So they've actually worked with them and are actually looking at integrating that. But their initial baseline is actually measuring the health of platforms and then developing, okay, what does that chatbot need to be saying to that user? And what is that appropriate? Yeah.
So we were just talking about terms of how like you need to have that kind of metrics also to know whether the products or use that measured impact or not.
Right. Yeah, and that's, I think it's hard. We were just talking about this. That is actually, I don't think a lot of platforms are really, we're in such a reactive mode right now that I don't think we can safely, like I'm just reading this interesting book about hate speech, and it's an academic who's suggesting that we need less censorship, not more, around hate speech. She's actually saying that most of the science suggests that even
Then that starts going into like
to hateful speech, even if it's targeted at you, there is no real science to suggest that you are in some sort of, you are going to end up in some sort of psychological distress. In fact, most of it points to its active might just incite you to activism and encourage you to do that. It's like a really interesting, I don't know how I feel about it. I'm not sure because I really struggle with this.
How like analytic.
No, well, we actually updated our guidelines. Let's do that because we initially said like, oh, you should counter, if we can't remove everything, it's like violence, but it's still hateful. We encourage you to counter that with like counter speech. And and we see that we actually removed that from our latest community guidelines because we realized, which is I think maybe where you might be going, it's actually not helpful. But her points are really, really interesting because of, let me see if I can pull it up. It's in my Kindle. I find it really interesting because I was telling someone it just makes me like, yeah, please, yeah. I can't, it's like something, yeah. I'll send you, But that's, helpful platform, definitely something to measure. I don't think they do it that well yet. And then I think there's not as much of an interest. I think there's not a business interest for a lot of places to do that. Like at Tumblr, we're interested because we're a smaller platform. So we like have a tight-knit community, and if that community isn't happy, then like we got to deal with it.
We just want your special double selection.
Like not externalities for them where they have getting like
Fine.
Yeah. So the idea is that we can make sensitivity which is tangential to our project. For me, I think like all of a sudden this idea of like community and
Also, it's not just like you're talking about that.
Well, it should be. You can imagine. One of the things I want to talk about is like I want to figure out, is there a universal, like are there some universal standards? Like should every platform have to submit to a community health index, and then like it have to at least be transparent so that you know before you get on that platform what that actually looks like. And I think that's something that's marketing people like it's so new. Yeah, we're in the wild frontier. Yeah. I appreciate your I'd love to talk to you about this because I am less optimistic. I think they are being rolled in Congress. We just have to do it. And I will say, and that's why it might be interesting for y'all to look, and it sounds like it's interesting that y'all's one of Madrid, is that what you're saying? The tool or the startup? Yeah. Okay, yeah. But like in Europe, like they're really, it's a double-edged sword. Because on one hand, they're ahead of the game. They're actually thinking about this stuff. On hate speech stuff, they are getting really aggressive about some things that I don't actually think are helpful for like freedom of speech and expression. So they're much farther ahead in terms of actually having government officials properly look and examine like what we should be asking from platforms. I think in the U.S. Concern is so nice that like Facebook is designed to that I don't know if there's as many constraints for Congress, you know. Eventually Congress is going to be, I think we'll see what the makeup looks like in this, you know, next election. But I don't know if the U.S. is in the same place. You know, we're more of a free market. We're now in a place, even though the only thing, you know, Donald Trump administration is focusing on is like antitrust, like laws, not necessarily like how they're actually behaving. So anyway, but I would love to talk about it because I think you might be more optimistic than I am. But I have no other reason. Okay, yeah. That's right.
I appreciate that. You're making
No, yeah, you're like so I'm not as much of a but yeah, maybe.
I think the situation is so bad.
Yeah.
That's my
It's true. It's at least they recognize it. I think now it's the question of like, are people sort of like, this is gonna like take some courage. Like this is gonna take a little bit of like people deciding, I think at the very top, like this is what our platform is about. If you're not about that, you need to tell. I think there's such a fear of like in Facebook in Google's case, posting that to be the biggest player, they want to be used for everything, right? They want to pervade like every area of life. So they're in a place where they're just not as much of an economic incentive to make those changes. But two, I think there's also this question of like not necessarily actually looking at how certain people or how users are operating, how parents are looking at some of their technology. They're just not using it right now. And because we are US-based, even though a lot of these places have offices all over the globe, we have really Western, like US values on this stuff. And that mostly means leave us alone, let us do our thing. We'll let you know if we need something. And I think that's kind of the attitude a little bit. And that's where I struggle with like working for a company that is owned by Verizon and being a former organizer. God, they're like, I will say Tumblr was owned by Yahoo when I first got there. We were and we're still a small team. But it's interesting seeing how even my former colleagues really, I saw at Google, but Facebook had actually really drank the juice. Really drank the juice. And it's like this is what we fought against. Like, and so I think that part is really, I'm just rambling now. Is there any that I'm here, I'll be back in December too, but I would love to stay in touch over email. And if there's anything else I can get y'all, because I do think that would be, I love that idea. That would be such an interesting thing to try to be supportive of on our end.
We'll send you a follow-up email. That's why experience the main thing that we is any contacts like that you have.
Yeah.
Again, there are any sort of like metrics or doesn't give us data or anything. Some sense of what we use
I would love to connect, because this might be an interesting thing for me to try to understand for like what we're thinking of, but to have y'all talk to like someone on our trust and safety team and maybe our community support team, because they're like the front, I think they're probably the front lines of that, and I imagine they have some version. It's probably not as sophisticated as they want it to be, but they probably have some version of knowing like, okay, when do we escalate something because we see it becoming like a trend. Blue Whale Challenge was another interesting one that might be worth. That was a mid-12 challenge. It was like did you ever hear about that? It was basically like a suicide pact, but like where you took the Blue Whale Challenge and then it became very viral. But that was one of those things that people, trust and safety teams weren't immediately seeing being flagged. There have been some work, studies, I think, on it, or at least it's been written about. But that might be an interesting thing to look at, because that was one of the more that really worked across a lot of different platforms. And was a global thing too, I think. Blue Whale Challenge.
Yes, exactly. That I heard.
You heard about that? And that was one that we had an example of, like, where people saw, like, oh, this is like really taking off, and then our users were flagging and even on their own trying to push back on some of that. But I think there are lots of examples. I lean on mental health a lot, just because that's, I think that at the end of the day, if you're cyberbullied, you're more likely to be a cyberbully. Like, there's lots of stuff, I think, and that's why I think co-curricular would be an interesting place for y'all to talk to, because they've realized that even with terrorism content and all these others, like, conversation about the fact that how certain people are coming in, vulnerable communities are coming online, and how they're being sort of manipulated, and how that behavior eventually way trends can trend or be sort of go viral, essentially. So, but yeah, I'd be happy to connect y'all with those guys. I think it'd be a place to start.
It'd also be interesting to see that for a lot of these interventions you are doing
Yeah.
Again, what are sort of the key line indicators?
Yeah.
We're again sort of taking a broader view of perhaps our project ideas. We want to give them, if you're going to really participate in projects and knowledge instead of
Yeah.
Call it integration, call it things like that.
Yeah. No, I think it's cool. I'll see what these would be good questions, I think, for next year, but I think we'll okay. So yeah, we'll talk. No, that's awesome. Yeah. No. Yes. Yeah, that's right. Awesome. Yeah, we'll talk more.
No, it just
Hi, everyone. Hello. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in a minute. If you could find your seats, that'd be great.
I completely agree.
Okay, cool. Should I go ahead? Okay, cool. So before we kind of dive into the trust and safety exercise, I wanted just to point a few things out on the community guidelines for each of the platforms. How many of y'all have ever read the community guidelines for any of the platforms that you use? You have? Look at that, yeah? Got someone very careful. They're, in some cases, more entertaining than others. But what are the platforms that y'all use? Twitter users? Big Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Kind of want to get a handle before I show y'all these. These are Tumblrs. I mentioned to you earlier, we kind of have a certain tone. But I want to just point these out because the trust and safety exercise is basically is supposed to be, I should say, based on what is and is not allowed. The community guidelines are sort of there as like a little bit of the rules of the road of like, here's what you can do on our platform, here's what you can't. And it's meant to really be a guide. It's also a guide for our trust and safety teams. It's how they action certain pieces of content, how they decide what to remove. It's also how we communicate, I think, to our users about what they can expect. I think there are lots of conversations right now happening around what is and is not included in community guidelines. I think sometimes it's not always super clear why. I think so. Like oftentimes, one of the best examples I've read about is maybe when someone is trying to highlight a specific instance in which hate speech was used against them or racism, and they use the platform to like spotlight that, and then they immediately get removed. And it's like, wait a second, like I'm trying to use this platform for what it was intended for, and now I can't. A few things I wanted to point out. Tumblr recently updated our guidelines specifically around hate speech. We originally had a line within our hate speech section, which I'll kind of, you can see that here. It's like kind of, it's a little bit short. Where we basically said that if you had, like in the cases of instances where you saw speech online or used any sort of content that could incite violence against any sort of any marginalized community, that even if it did not necessarily break those rules, that we invited you to counter that with more speech. Basically this was like this idea of self-policing. And then after Charlottesville, I think a lot of folks were like, wait a second, you can't really put the onus on the user. Like that's just not fair. Like there's no sort of equal playing field there. And so we took that line out and sort of really got a little bit more specific. You can see here, it's interesting, veteran status, sexual orientation, disability, disease, and then really trying to explain to our users what that meant. And we still left a line in there about you can express your concerns to them directly or use Tumblr to speak up, challenge ideas, raise awareness, generate discussion and debate. So we still wanted that to be there, but those hate speech sort of guidelines are just really difficult because it's a really slippery slope. As I mentioned before, I think a lot of people may use platforms just to spotlight something and then often end up getting removed. And we at Tumblr, again, if you're coming on to sort of espouse your views and really express yourself, sometimes that can get into some murky territory. One other section I want to point out is terrorism content. Terrorism content is one of the really interesting places where I think a lot of platforms have, because of government intervention and a lot of technology, terrorism content is coming down increasingly quicker. It's being spotted. A lot of that has come, though, from government officials really mandating it. In the case of Germany, there's an interesting, and I don't think it is official yet, but I think Germany was looking at actually mandating that terrorism content come down within the hour that it was posted, which is, you can imagine, can be very taxing or almost impossible for a lot of teams. But that's one of the places where we found a lot of common ground. Yeah, go first.
I'm curious, do you ever work with governments on like blacklists or like do any data sharing?
Let's see. So yes and no. Like there is for the terrorism content, it's one of the places too where I think there's a lot of shared information across governments and platforms themselves to actually, if there is, and I can actually send an article on this because this is actually pretty fascinating technology, but there's a data sharing between all the groups so that if they post on one platform, it can easily be sort of traced and then immediately sort of applied. And in the case of sharing with governments, we have to be really careful, but with terrorism content, there's just a lot of collaboration happening. I wouldn't say that for every topic, but terrorism content there's a lot more of that collaboration.
Yeah, I just wanted to, you mentioned Germany. How does the U.S. stand on this, and like in comparison to both on the issue of terrorism and then other like mandated takedowns of content? How does it compare?
On terrorism content, I think it's a little more even. I think everyone is sort of, figured out, terrorism is bad for everyone, and it is such a global phenomenon.
And do they like mandate it within the hour? Or
No. Germany, it is very uneven on enforcement.
Okay.
So Germany is by far the most aggressive. The UK and the larger EU countries are a little more around like 24 hours, which is still difficult, which is still really hard. But that I would say that the European Union, the UK are very much in this space. The UK in particular is very, very focused and placing a lot of attention right now. There's some interesting, I think they were white papers that have come out where UK is being you can tell moving into a space where they're going to be a lot more prescriptive with technology companies, and they're placing a lot of the emphasis on the tech company, whereas the EU, and I would say especially in Ireland, I think you can see where Ireland is situated in this place where they're a home to a lot of these tech companies, and so a lot of their approaches to sort of how around enforcement and the types of laws and regulations that they're at least exploring are much more across the board around like, we need digital literacy, we need governments, we need parents and educators. It's a little more holistic, but in the UK it's a bit different. And in other countries we run into bigger issues around governments being much more involved around what we take down. And that's always a hard thing, but yeah. So it's uneven at best. So terrorism content. And then I just wanted to show y'all a couple of quick other things. What was that? No. What was it? Self-harm. This is an area where the UK, I think, is really sort of leading the way. There is a huge emphasis on child safety, and especially around exposure to violence and gore. That's one of the areas that they're I think very focused on. We don't see as much of that conversation in the States. To your question, it's super interesting. You can tell like the US is a little more of this place where we definitely care about hate speech. Like that's very much a focus. But in other places we're a bit more, I guess, we allow a bit more. And I think in the UK, partially because government is quite a bit more involved and examining a lot of this type of behavior in a case where I think the U.S. is being a little more hands-off. But self-harm is always a big topic in the UK and EU countries. Sensitive content, and then I just want to walk through these because I always think they're so fascinating. And I want to show you all Instagram and Facebook's really quick because Facebook especially is very quite a bit more strict. We also have to deal with, and you can see, I think it's always fascinating to read these because these are all things, most of these guidelines, in the case of all these platforms, these weren't things that, unfortunately, I think platforms came up with because they were like, oh, this is what we expect from users. I think they actually had no one had any idea what to expect from users. And then this is derived from having to be reactive, having to pay attention to sort of the health of the community and really determining, okay, what behaviors are really trending and what's the really bad stuff. Sorry. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the process or whether this happens if users come to you and say, there's this problematic account, I've gone over these guidelines, these user guidelines, and I can see that they violate this, this, and this.
Mm-hmm.
And then do you track how often this happens, and do you have any idea like what percentage of complaints you actually find are real violations of your
Such a good question. I wish I really wanted to bring her, have us do this together, but our trust and safety person can be here. She could talk about this a bit more. I can answer the first part of your question. I think it's harder to get into percentages. You also run into issues too with a lot of our platforms where it's just some of those numbers aren't there isn't. It feels, I think for a lot of platforms, unsafe to necessarily dive into a lot of these percentages, but it's something that I think we're going to need to explore as teams just to really talk about what types of content. We were talking earlier during the break around like the health of the platform, and I think everyone needs to sort of wrap their brains around that. So I don't have the answer to that. But in terms of the process, that is often the case, is that users will flag certain pieces of content, and some of it may be even pieces that were removed, or in some cases where it's like, oh, this was removed and this shouldn't have been removed, and here's why. And then that will, usually often that will respond, and it'll go back up. But in the cases of the ones where it's often flagged, it's hard. I don't know how often our trust and safety team, if it's more often than not that they're actually having, it's like, oh yes, that's actually accurate. But in a lot of cases, unfortunately, it's that in the cases of hate speech, we ran into this a lot with revenge porn, where that revenge porn was also an area that I would say has been a recent thing that U.S. is definitely paying attention to in other countries, where we did need to act very quickly because it was harassment at that point. And so that stuff we try to remove really quickly, but it's really hard to tell. And this actually leads to a really important point, but I think a lot of users, and I don't even think Tumblr is perfect, but it is sometimes really hard to navigate that reporting process. And I think this is going to be thinking about as platforms how to train users to know what content to flag. In some cases it may have been, I think a lot of times they'll abuse the reporting structure. We see that a lot. And then on the flip side, you've got a lot of users who've trained themselves. Like we have a lot of platforms, including our own. I think in Twitter they have like a trusted flagger program. So someone who's actually well versed in that process of reporting, and will it'll go to a certain queue on the trust and safety team, so it gets immediately acted upon. But a lot of times you have users who don't always know based on the guidelines what is actually a violation. And so I think that's a tough thing.
Because it's interesting that you mentioned that Facebook's user guidelines are even more strict, because I feel like the perception from the outside is that Facebook and Twitter have these terms of service and it's almost like a show, like they don't enforce them. And you hear so many people saying, I flagged this, this is harassment, I flagged it, they did nothing, because they don't want to purge any users from their platform. This is how they make money.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm just wondering if there's any kind of like tracking to see, how often complaints that are valid actually result in someone getting removed from the platform.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question, and you're actually hitting on something that I was hoping we could kind of talk about as one of the solutions, because I don't think because that transparency, this is the thing I think we've talked about all the time is like transparency and humility, right? Like you need to be transparent about what actually exists on the platform. But I think in the case of technology companies, you have to have humility to admit like, there is no technology that exists. There's no amount of humans I can hire to actually address this. So what do we do then? What are we left with? And I think we're left with bigger conversations like this where you potentially explore all of us sort of contributing something to some level of transparency around what people can expect on the platform. To your other question about Facebook and Twitter, I think the challenge with those two platforms are, and Facebook's just so big, I will say I think Facebook attempts, given how big they are, to actually like really push their guidelines. I think the hard thing with Twitter is that they're very uneven in their enforcement of their rules. And I think Facebook really tries to attempt to do that, and sometimes maybe they go the other direction. In the case of Twitter, I think they're saying they're allowing certain voices. They're basically discriminating on like, well, if you have a large following, if you are a celebrity, you go by different rules than everybody else. And I think that's where it can feel a bit more showy. But then some of it really is internally. I think there are still these real challenges that that a lot of platforms, we aren't having a public dialogue about how difficult it is to really address all these problems. And that's part of it too, is that we do make them, it does feel a little bit like a show because people are kind of feeling around in the dark, guessing at like, oh, well, can I create this perfect rule, this perfect policy that can be evenly applied across all situations? And the answer is no, you can't. Sorry.
Quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Just, on that Twitter comment, by like celebrity, do you mean that they're more willing to take down content of celebrities because of a large following, or less willing?
It's a good question. I don't speak for Twitter.
Yeah.
But I think I think you could see this in the public. So I would say it could go both ways. I think in some cases people often look at Alex. That was the issue with Alex Jones, right? That he was sort of this center of gravity on Twitter that people maybe even follow just purely out of entertainment, but it meant that they were getting on the platform, they were interacting. So I would argue that I think a lot of if you were an influencer, if you're a social media influencer, it looks as if the rules don't apply to you always. And your content isn't subject to the same rules as if you're an average user. And that part, I think, is the real challenge for Twitter, and why I think that they're at the heart of a lot of this is because their policies look like they're being enforced very unevenly. And I think I'm not saying anything you can read in the news either. So hopefully that's okay. Yeah.
Going back to the Alex Jones example and something you brought up, which is it worth purging a user? You know, these are all private companies and they have an interest in making advertising money. So in the Alex Jones case, was there ever anyone at Tumblr who advocated for keeping him because that would bring more users on, therefore more advertising dollars? Bottom line is important, blah, blah, blah. Because I worked in privacy and that's what we heard all the time, which is like, our competitors are doing it, like we're losing money from doing the ethical thing here. And how do you fight that? Because at the end of the day, you do have to answer to your shareholders and your board of directors.
Yeah. Oh man, you're asking like the $1 million question. So in the case of Tumblr, our user base is so highly progressive, and there was such an uproar. Literally, I do want to show you all this article where the users are like, "We ran Alex Jones off the platform," and we were like, "What?" And we were like, it was like a double-edged sword because we were like, "Oh, we kind of want to tell the public that like actually we had to remove him," but at the same time we were like glad. But we, in our case, our team is such a reflection of the community, and our CEO is also someone who I think really was just like, I can't allow, like lives not far from Sandy Hook, and really felt like, oh, we just can't allow this. We've actually seen how hateful his comments, all of his comments on other platforms essentially violated the Tumblr guidelines off the bat. And then once he put up the Twitter tweet sort of inviting us to look at him, then it became a very public conversation. So for us, it wasn't the monetization question wasn't as much for us because our community is so very niche. But I'm sure in the other cases, like that's difficult because he's a showman. He's doing that for very real reasons. So I don't. That's not an answer to your question. In our case, I can speak for us. That wasn't necessarily a factor. Sorry, I think there was somebody on the. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
So I have a question about flagging and taking down and reporting. So you mentioned how it is like a very reactive instead of preventative process. But so my first question is, what's preventing that person from creating another new account after you take down their account and then spewing the same hate speech? And the second question is, what do you do with those posts? Do you just delete them and remove them from the platform, never to use again, or do you archive them and in some fashion use them as a way to create preventative tools, for example, with AI or with the engineering aspect that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You're already getting to I think some of the solutions to some of this conversation, because I hadn't thought about that. So I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if our legal team will let me answer that last question either, about whether or not. I think once they're removed, and we'd probably notify for privacy purposes. I'm guessing, but I will confirm. I imagine that those I don't know that those are necessarily being stored, but it would be an interesting case study for sure. So I'd love to maybe take that one back and actually see if we can look into that. And then your first question was whether or not, when things are flagged, what prevents people from removing or moving on to just another account? There's not really one. I think we just have to really police it. We use every amount of trust and safety resources. We hope our users can flag that type of behavior. But in the case of Tumblr, it's very difficult because we don't collect a lot of data. It's very easy for you to create, use a different email account. And I think I think that's the case probably for a lot of platforms, where you could just easily create another Gmail and you start all over. So that, I imagine that happens quite a bit. But I think that's probably the case for us, is that there's no real science to that, but we just do the best we can to sort of manage and be vigilant. Any other questions? Yeah.
From a public policy perspective, do you ever worry that by banning all these folks, they just go to their 4chans and kind of exacerbate the filter bubble?
Yeah, I think we were talking earlier, there's this really, and why can I not think of the author's name, but I'm reading this really fascinating book about an academic that is arguing in her book that we should have less censorship to counter hate speech and not more. So she's basically saying there should be no rules, because this is one of her theories, she's talks about evidence of this, is that as soon as you start to get really prescriptive with other platforms, they essentially just go to others that will always welcome them, will always allow them to be there. And we saw this with Charlottesville. That's where ultimately so much of that organizing happened, we're on these really underground, sort of the dark net. And I think that's always going to be the case. And I think with hate speech, that's something we really need to be aware of, because I think that ultimately is where that can fester. And in sort of her argument, she also mentions that by pushing it underground, it's preventing a very public conversation around things like racism and unconscious bias. If you push it underground, then you're just not publicly talking about it. I don't know how I feel about her full argument. I want to be super transparent about that, but I do think her point is well taken for those reasons, and that's a huge issue. I think in the case of Tumblr, we're about communities. I mentioned to you, I showed you all the things that we're about. We're also really about marginalized communities, and I think there's one of the things that we've talked about as a team. At what point, if you know that you're trying to create a certain type of experience as a user, you just sort of own that and say, this is what we're about. And if you're not about that, then this isn't the place for you. But it still will send people other directions, I think. Don't you have a question?
No, I just wanted to say on that it's that there is always this balance, and so I come from Europe. I live in Germany, and there are very strict laws about Holocaust denial, and I would argue the argument in that book, which we have in Germany, we have this discussion, I feel, all the time, and the answer to that is the law against Holocaust denial does not prevent the discussion of Holocaust and German history and the German role in that process overall. So I think this is these are kind of sometimes also a little bit tricks to say, well, if you have to allow hate speech, but you can discuss prejudice, racial prejudice, without going into hate speech.
Yeah, I think that's the Holocaust denial, that was another one that I almost put up there, because I was I think that's the other thing that perfectly counters what she was saying. But was also like another inflection point is when Mark Zuckerberg sort of had that public interview where he was sort of talking about it. I mean, it was really hard. But I think this is like an example of where we can, hopefully, something we can learn from. So I'm going to keep going because I want to go ahead and get into trust and safety exercise. I do encourage y'all, if you get a chance, definitely look at these community guidelines. They may seem boring at first, but I think they are probably the single best public insight into how platforms are really thinking about how to police content, and then how, I think in the case of some places too, how they're inviting users to be a part of that process. But I want to go ahead, and again, this is kind of some sensitive stuff. So I want to just look through a few of these examples. So I thought what we might do, because I think I want to kind of turn it more into a group exercise when we move into more of the solutions around some of these conversations. But for now, I wanted to just give you all a chance, and I can move down through, but I basically have 5 examples here. And Eric, you'll actually notice one from one of our conversations here in a second. But basically 5 examples of where we have struggled, and these are from various platforms. And I've like rearranged some of the words to try to still get the point across, but also be cognizant of these are rooted from real examples. But these are examples. This is mostly on hate speech. So I wanted to take a second, just a few minutes, if y'all could kind of look through these, and I can move on down. But essentially the question is for you, based on these examples, and again, I know I'm not giving you any context, which is ultimately what our trust and safety team would have to do and really dig in, but kind of how you would action some of these pieces. Would you remove it? Would you suspend some of these accounts? Or do you feel like these don't actually violate hate speech guidelines at all, based on what you think to be true? You want me to zoom in? Okay, you can definitely do that.
So not read that at all.
Let's see. Ooh, too big. Is that a little better?
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'll move this over here. And then tell me when I need to move down.
I think, is there any way to scroll a little to the left?
Let's see, hang on. I think that these are it. I think this is the end. So let me double check. One second, yeah. I'm also offline, so I'm having trouble, like I can't move anything. So I'm gonna go in like that. Does that cover it? Are y'all able to see
Perfect.
that? And I'll give it just a couple minutes to move down. Example 4 is kind of a long one. Are y'all okay if I move down to that one? Pretty good. Okay to move down? people go to great lengths to make make a case. All right, go ahead and move down.
It's so cool, the guy who like now owns the term, and that's really, I mean, you have to give it to them, they have tried.
Yeah, it's true. I really like it. You should probably, we should talk about that, actually. For people who don't know. All right. I'll leave it at that one. Let me know when y'all are, everybody ready? I think I'll just start with the first example. Actually, let's just start with the fifth example because that was sort of an interesting one to throw in there. I got some inspiration from that, from some others. Joe, everybody recognize this?
NWA, fuck
Yeah,
the police.
lyrics. But but seen without context, like, this gets pretty close to inciting violence, right? I just pulled like pieces of it. You can find the lyrics elsewhere. But this is one of the examples of you've got lyrics, a song, pure like basically expression. Thank you. And then, but do you leave that up? In the case of Tumblr, I noticed you can't, like there's no way, when you search the title, you can't find it. Nothing will come up, even in different versions. But this is an example of something too, where there's sort of this clear tension between someone who's expressing a certain opinion, and in the case of art, music, but it is certainly taken out of context, something where you're actually inciting violence. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like what you would do if you had that on your platform? Do you leave that up?
I would leave it up.
You would leave it up? Anybody else? You leave it? Because it's music? Is that what you think?
Art, yeah.
It's
I mean,
art.
there was, like a recent movie about this whole group. So,
It's public. It's like there's a body of work out there, I guess, right?
yeah, and I mean, the song speaks to the experience of Black boys in the late 80s and, certainly still today. So,
Yeah.
I think it's an important song.
But I think what you said is important because, for example, so I don't come from here and I have never seen this. And I had the same thing, like, okay, this obviously the form is art. So do we actually, as a society, have a different rules for art and for free speech? And so that is one point. And another point is what you said, so context is really important.
Yeah.
So I think, yes, this could stay up, but I would like to have that context around it and say this is something.
Interesting. Where you almost, when you as a user, it's almost like when we ask users, we're like, oh, if you have sensitive content, especially artists, especially, we often ask them, like, you should flag this, like proactively flag this. In this case, almost asking them to add, like, here's when this was made, and here's what this meant, and give a little bit of history. That would be an interesting concept. Yeah.
I think there are three distinctions we have to draw. The first distinction is between content, tone, and intent. Intent being the most vague. Example 5, this one has liberal use of vulgarities, but what would bring it over the line would be the explicit mention of violence against a minority, like the grabbing his nuts one. Mm-hmm. But if you put this within quotation marks, then I would say this is clarifying the intent. And in addition, I think this is where technology can come into play if you're talking about tools to monitor content. If there are already phrases or lyrics that are already flagged within the system as being in context, then this would make the job easier to police the community guidelines. The other two things you have to separate are
The second one is insensitivity versus illegality. So, for example, the previous example where they use the she pronoun instead of they and saying that they're all right, I think that's blunt and insensitive, but not necessarily illegal. After all, in your community user guidelines, you say narrowly defined but deeply important categories. So the narrowly defined one is very telling because you have to draw a very clear line between what is insensitive versus what's illegal, which brings me to my third point, an unsound argument versus illegality. Example 4, the white supremacist one, genocide, presents a very unsound argument to all of us here, but it's not necessarily illegal, so the onus, I would imagine, would be on the user base, because you talk about how Tumblr likes to self-police, the user base to actually correct him and rebut him. Any rebuttal would highlight how fallacious that argument is. So the three things are content, tone, intent. Second one, insensitivity versus illegality. And the third one, what is unsound versus what is illegal. And I would say you can rely on both technology, like monitoring tools, data monitoring tools, as well as using community policing efforts. So the onus is often on the user base.
Yeah. No, it sounds like you have you could probably, sound like you're right out of, I think, how we try to train some of our users. That intent piece is incredibly important. But I also think we struggle, again, being a platform who's trying to protect some of these communities. And even though, in your case, you're not wrong, like in the case of the transgender example, I think for us where we really struggle is that that's a community that doesn't often find a lot of safe spaces. And so if it's that person continues to do that, to troll them, at what point, I think where we're challenged is, at what point does it become harassment? Like at what point is that something not a safe space? So those are really sort of good points. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted in reaction, I agree on 2 of your 3 points, but I don't agree with the hate speech, because just that somebody is unsound doesn't make it less dangerous. So yes, okay, we all see that it's like completely convoluted argument, but many arguments actually which led to horrible things in human history are not really like Nobel Prize winning arguments. So I think that here it's much more difficult for, you need no amount of context helps you on that, because you would have to really link to some of the UN stuff and say, these are the examples of genocide, this is in no way a genocide. It's an attempt to appropriate existing legal concept for white supremacist propaganda.
I would agree with you on the basis that the message gains traction with a wider audience. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there was this hope with the white genocide example. I think there has been this hope both with tech platforms and with the media that if you just kind of like air these arguments, people will see how ridiculous they are and they'll fall away. And it really hasn't borne out. I mean, every time these arguments and the people who make them are given a platform, they grow more powerful, and it's dangerous. And you could tie this to what happened in Charlottesville. So I think example 4 is a real problem. I think it counts as hate speech, and I don't think it should be given a platform.
Yeah. I want to talk about that. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. So when you're evaluating these potential hate speech reports, do you take the comments and what's happening in the community into consideration?
Yes.
Because with this, for instance, say it produces this pretty productive dialogue where people are pointing out flaws, those are being like, it's been like 10 years since I used Tumblr, like are they being recorded or upped or something?
Yeah.
And would that make the post okay to keep in your community then? Or would you still look at this just in isolation?
That's actually a good question. I think that's an interesting point. I know that we have to look at context. Typically we're looking at blog history. So if there is essentially a diatribe with every post on these comments, then we kind of know, there's this history. And trying to look at it too, to like, is is it possible that someone was reblogging this or pulling this from somewhere else in an attempt to have a conversation with the platform about this particular topic? Like, that's always possible. So your question about comments, I think we'd have to be really careful about that. I would have to ask on that about whether or not we factor in, like, oh, is there a productive conversation happening around this? And this is where I struggle with your point, because I don't know the answer, but because this also raises this point about, do they go underground? And then does that eliminate any sort of conversation around why this is really an unsound argument? Because I see the danger here is this: if you're a vulnerable person and maybe you're somewhere on the edge in terms of the way that you look at race, you look at this and you're like, oh wow, they pull from a really, appears to be a really valid source. Like, is this true? And I think that could be dangerous as well. So.
And also, I mean, it's based on a lie.
Yes,
so,
yes.
So, like, just the point, like, a lawyer invented the term genocide. It's not true.
Right.
And so what do you do?
Right.
I mean, it's not only that it's stupid and it gets worse as it goes, but I don't know, like, can you start to, and this is, I think, maybe like, yeah, but you cannot know what is, I mean, for some things you can fact check it. Mm-hmm. That's what fact checking is for. So here you can actually fact check it and say, well, this is not true.
Right. Yeah, these are really, I mean, I think this is where our team, I think, really struggles, because one, you do have to give context. I didn't give you any context here, which might have made this a little bit easier, or maybe it wouldn't make it easier at all. It just puts it more into that gray area. But these are, any other comments about this? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, for the example with the lyrics, it's tough to say that something like that wouldn't be allowed to be posted after being able to see videos of Black people getting killed by police officers in their cars on the street, and if those kinds of videos are being published online from cell phones, it would seem like bizarre to not be able to post a song like that is just describing something that we're already able to see on things like Facebook and other platforms.
Right. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think this really gets also to the presentation on Tumblr of sort of the conversations that happen, in the sense that these aren't sort of, you have like question and then a response. So I assume that the way this appears is someone posted the question and then they reblogged it and put a response.
Yeah.
And so you wouldn't necessarily, if you saw that question, see the response. Mm-hmm. And then sort of to get also to tie that into what you were saying, is two things is, like, I don't think just because it's a lyric or it's like a piece of art that it's still not offensive and somehow it should get a pass. But I can imagine a situation where perhaps a police officer was killed in action and someone posts this in direct response to that, or in, say, a callback, say, to a memorial someone put up. Yeah. All of a sudden then, even though that's expressing, a real concern for people that are over police, that it's presented now in a way that's actually causing harm to another community.
Yeah.
But again, it's interesting, because usually, traditionally, how this would show up is, you have like a Facebook post, and you have these long list of comments, and then maybe someone posts it. But here it's like, I guess my question for you is, can you get from the question from anonymous to response, or do you have to start at response in order to see the entire conversation?
Ask that again. Make sure I'm following.
So it's, if you start at question from anonymous, someone just saying, oh, white genocide's silly.
Yeah.
Would you then somehow you would see that, for example, White Genocide Project reblogged it, but you wouldn't see what they added in addition to it?
A lot of times we can't. Yeah, in a lot of cases, with a reblog you can. So you would be able to see you mean the responses to this, right?
Like from question from anonymous.
Oh, that would be, you wouldn't have to, that would be harder. That would be a little bit difficult that would be harder to track.
Capacity to follow like a single conversation unless you're like at the end of it, right?
Yeah. yeah, so that would be, I think, yeah, that's one of the challenges, and probably one of the challenges with the product too. But it also gets it, when we're talking about it too, it makes it feel challenging because it's a lot easier. This is the concern with people, with government officials around the ability to be anonymous is, you can kind of do some of those fly-by-the-night comments, but what we've seen is like on a lot of platforms, even if you can't be anonymous, people still find ways to do that. But this is often one of the concerns. But I'm still thinking about this context thing. Okay, sorry, we'll go ahead, and then I may pivot into our last section.
I thought the lyrics example was kind of interesting because you're getting into the culture and almost like historical space. So I was wondering if there's like a kind of like certain amount of time that can pass where it's okay to bring things up. And I know like depending on the context, because I'm thinking about parallels in history to like forbid the banned books list and how like political authorities might ban something. So I think platforms are in a particularly interesting position to be able to like set that kind of censorship at a higher or lower level than the community or government at large. So when I see the lyrics, I'm like, oh, that song came out like a long time ago. So, but it's something that's new and recent. It strikes me as more offensive, even though I know that doesn't make a ton of sense. But I was wondering if that can get officially codified somehow.
I mean, it would be an interesting to try to understand, because I think y'all are all hitting at really interesting points, which is this idea of, because some of this is like really basic history, right? Of how we teach not just like how pop culture sort of shapes some of these dialogues, but also generally how we might teach unconscious bias or how that plays a role, because that's what I think is often missing from this case, is that in the case of the White Genocide Project, I'll end this point, but in the case of the White Genocide conversation is that, if you have anyone who is like, a young person who is maybe, again, I use my rural public school upbringing and had a really good education, but it did not look like, and that is the case for so many public school kids. I feel like a lot of private schools are exploring what it means to really sort of teach history around race and genocide really properly and like really have conversations around that. That doesn't really happen in a lot of schools. And so I think a lot of people are coming to these platforms and are in places where they could look at that and be like, oh, interesting. I didn't know it was a thing. Like maybe I'll like look into that or whatever, and maybe it could run its course. But this is the thing that I think you're getting at with some of this context building that I think is super critical. And I think platforms need to be viewed, and our technology teams need to be viewed as collaborators in this larger education conversation, because I think we're not going to be able to police all of this. I don't think that there is any amount of technology as it exists today, and then certainly no amount of humans, and I think Mark Zuckerberg would be the first to say this, that you can't really hire enough humans also to police this. And even in that case, humans are bringing their own bias, they're bringing all that stuff to the table, even when they are moderating. But that's a really difficult conversation unless you as a user are sort of taking some responsibility and sort of bringing sort of that knowledge and education, that context. So anyway, but I'll leave it at that, and then maybe we can pivot into the last thing.
I just wanted to say that, like, thinking about it and reacting to the conversation we are having, there is already a resource where the things have been sorted out, where there is a viable community which discusses, and that's Wikipedia.
Yeah.
And so for the genocide thing, I mean,
Yeah.
you don't have to replicate as a platform. You don't need like people to become experts in genocide. You can link.
You can actually look at it.
You can link to it, and maybe even like start as a platform a conversation with Wikipedia and say, okay, so there is this resource. We want to actually direct our users, members of our community,
Right.
to that and contribute to their education.
Yeah.
And so you can, I'm sure there will be something on the White Genocide Project there as well, critically assessed people, and it's sorted out.
Yeah, Wikipedia is such a good example of this too. And I think it would be fascinating to see if there's a way, if there's some way to sort of make that connection so that you get people, it also makes me wonder, and I'm thinking out loud here, but like with the fuck the police lyrics, like do you do you put something up, especially if it's without context, but do you give up like the opportunity for users to think about like how they're adding context to that, like asking them to do that? Do you hide some of that content until it has been given that context? Like, I think there's, because you do get into, and it's interesting that you bring up like book banning and censoring speech, because those things can be really dangerous, I think, to, if you start with one, it then becomes very quickly like, oh, well, what, and I could think of a lot of examples, but I won't get into them now, but like, of where you could easily swing to the other side and say, well, this is also art. And I think that's the thing that I kind of worry about. So with that, because we only have like a few minutes, and y'all have already touched on these, and since it's a small enough group, maybe we could just do it this way. But y'all have touched on a few things that I thought could definitely be things that we could explore as potential solutions. But just to put a sort of a fine point on it, if technology companies, social media platforms, so platforms who are moderating content, and that can look like a lot of different things, not just social media, but if human moderation and automated moderation cannot still get us sort of this perfect ecosystem where everyone is participating in civil discourse, where everyone is actually having constructive dialogue, where as parents you feel like your son or your daughter is actually having a safe experience, like what are some of the solutions? So one of the ways I've been thinking about this, and maybe we can take just a few minutes, and I'm happy if you all just we want to like spitball on this, but one of the things that I've been thinking about is there are more players, but for now I thought it would be important to focus on the 4 major players in this conversation, the people who have to be involved. Number one, it's the user. Y'all mentioned this before. I think one of the things that's really lacking in a lot of these conversations is really inviting users to be a part of that process beyond just flagging content and beyond policing hate speech. So what is the user, as a social media user, do you want your experience to look like? What would it look like for you to still feel like everyone is able to express themselves, you can learn something, you can expand your mind, but still feel like, I also don't want to see that content. Like, how do you do that? So number one, the user. Number two is the parent. I think parents are increasingly, as younger and younger generations are getting on platforms. In the case for most platforms, you're 13 years old. You can be 13 years old. So that's really young. So you've got a lot of parents who are like, you can think about pornography, you can think about violence, gore, all of those things, not to mention hate speech violations. So as a parent, what are some of the things and the solutions that you would want platforms to think about? The third person is the tech CEO. This gets at like your question about advertising. Like, how do you have a viable business? But how do you also take responsibility for the fact that like no longer do some of these rules just apply to the content on your platform, but that ultimately you are shaping what is happening in the public square. Like you are the one dictating what's bad speech, good speech, dangerous speech. How do you own that but still have a safe business? So that's the third. And then the fourth, and I mentioned in the US, I think it's still, Mark Warner's team, Senator Warner's team is doing some interesting stuff around this, but ultimately the government official in the UK and EU and all across the globe is looking at like when does government actually start to get involved? We've seen this with terrorist content, so they're really mandating that stuff come down really quickly, and it's actually been incredible sort of effort, and we've seen examples. It's still really hard, and I think there's still terrorist content is still living, underground, but ultimately I think government officials are responsible for looking at what would not crush business, not totally eliminate a lot of these platforms. One of my concerns about Tumblr is that we're not Google and Facebook, and you have a ton of medium-sized startups who moderate content, but you don't necessarily want to regulate them like you would a Google and Facebook who have infinite amount of resources. So what's the answer to that? So I thought we could just sit with that. If y'all want to, we can take a couple minutes for that, or if y'all want to have ideas. But I'd love to just talk about what you would propose as potential solutions, or at least beginnings, a beginning spot to address some of this stuff. All right, so a lot of hands. I'll start with you.
So
just now you talked about like competition and like business models and then I was wondering if like companies actually come together to form like an industrial standard to regulation, then in that way you solve the problem of moderation that all the firms commonly share, and also you wouldn't fall into that problem of like, oh, that company A is being less ethical and they're getting more business. But if all the companies come together and establish an industrial standard that everyone adheres to, it kind of solves the problem. So I'm wondering if such conversation has been happening, or has anyone raised a similar idea?
I think the closest that someone's publicly raised this is Mark Zuckerberg. He's talked or alluded to this idea of needing like a United Nations for social media, that there needs to be a governing body for a lot of this. I think the question is, and we've talked about this a lot, and I think this is very public, but like, what's the incentive for a lot of these companies to get involved? I think we're getting close to like the PR nightmare becoming enough of like a motivation, but I think that's like ultimately who's going to really drive that. It'll be interesting to see if, to your point, if like you could see something like that coming out of the EU, given that Germany and others are really leading this effort. But he's sort of alluded to that as well. And there are a couple of folks, the UN, I can't remember his full title, but there's a UN lead on freedom of expression, and I feel like he's not specifically said that, but I think this is super key, right? Like we were talking about this during the break, like no standard at this point. So that part, I think that governing body or something that you can kind of have. There is one group that is mostly a freedom of expression group, and I think they're largely based in DC. Almost all the major platforms except Twitter are a part of that, and that is a body that is essentially designed to just make sure that everyone is kind of staying in line with each other. It doesn't have any enforcement, so that there's no teeth to it. It's just simply there to provide constructive feedback as people are thinking about. But that's something that I think we could
Twitter not a part of it?
Great question. I don't know. I think they have a trust and safety council. They have some. I think they kind of feel like there are other ways that they can do that. But I think it's interesting times because it might have been helpful. I think might be helpful, I should say. So, any other thoughts?
Yeah,
Solutions?
What you said about education was really important, and maybe a fifth factor in this is like also the teacher.
Yeah.
And I know the Southern Poverty Law Center came out with a really interesting report recently that said that they surveyed thousands of high school students, and only 8% of high school seniors could identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. Wow. And that's like such like deep misunderstanding of history that leads, I'm assuming it has to lead to like posts like the White Genocide Project, and teachers might have a big role to play here, and maybe tech companies working with schools is something that.
I think that would be, this is kind of initially what I was exploring as the idea. What would it look like for us, not just to get people back online? Like I think there has to be this element of not just creating a tool like a digital literacy tool or curriculum on the platform so you could come back to our platform, but more like a collective investment. Like could we look at, and this is me speaking not from Tumblr, but more from my background, but would there be a scenario in which you could see all companies being asked to invest a certain amount of their profits to digital literacy, which my boss will kill me when he hears me say that, so we have to cut that out. But I think there is sort of this ownership, and this gets back to, because fake news isn't just, if you're not on social media, that still impacts you. So I think there's now almost this social responsibility that comes with them actually sort of us owning the fact that like, if we're going to be a part of this and make profit off of it, like how are we really giving back? And I think that digital literacy, so that's kind of what I'll be interested to explore, like, is that an avenue, what that would look like? And
people should be able to identify like fake news as fake, and half the problem in that is not knowing history or not knowing facts.
Yeah, and it not getting divisive. Yeah, I mean that's the thing. And again, I say this as a Southerner, and that's, you see it getting so, the content back and forth on like Facebook especially, my mom tells me about it all the time. But like in those small towns where you have places that don't, that education isn't there, it really, like that behavior is exacerbated on these social media platforms and this misinformation. And it's not, you don't want to place the blame on the user, right? Like it's not their fault. That's not, they haven't been given access to that. So anyway, I love that thought. Yeah.
I've kind of been thinking about like weird technological ways to enforce social contracts. So these are all kind of fringy, but there's that platform Civil, which is the reimagined, it's CVL, and it's reimagining journalism, of course with like blockchain. But the idea is like you buy coin and you are kind of supporting journalism as an alternative funding model to having it be advertiser driven. So I think they actually just announced their launch. It's going to be like sometime around now. So, and there's a great podcast called Zigzag about 2 female entrepreneurs that basically have Civil investing in their project and trying to explore like future of journalism. Is there something here? But the idea of buying in to that is kind of interesting. And I know it's not ideal for Tumblr, but I do wonder if the future of platforms will be distributed by design. Have you heard of Mastodon?
No.
So it's a kind of like social platform that has, it's federated, and I'm not super sure exactly how that works, but I kind of wonder, if at least putting myself in a parent's shoes or the shoes of anyone that decides like, this is how I want to engage with the platform, maybe as you sign up, you can specify your personal rules of engagement, and then people start splintering off. Because I do recognize it's a little odd sometimes, like, I think of Instagram as where you post your lattes and stuff, and when the Kavanaugh confirmation happened, of course everything blew up, but it was a kind of an odd place. I don't think of Instagram as the place to see those posts. I definitely think of that as Tumblr. And if you are a parent, maybe you can have better like rules of engagement of like, yes, I'm okay with my child entering a version of this platform that are on these rules that we've already engaged in, and that can help kind of contain the viral spread of a lot of like hate speech, misinformation that kind of pervades through all parts of society. Kind of like enforcing, there used to be the don't talk about politics or religion in public, and now that's all we talk about all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe you can isolate that more.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Because it's interesting to see how Generation Z is, and I'm sure a lot of you may actually be very close to that, but how they can move in and out of all the platforms. Like I could barely use one, and they're like using it for different things. And be interesting. You got to wonder if they're like more nimble at something like that. Like if they would be able to better sort of identify ways in which they would use certain platforms and sort of have that conversation. That's a really interesting thought. It might actually be more sustainable too. Yeah.
I just want to kind of talking about what you brought up with fake news, like how did it get here, where did it come from? One thing that's interesting in the ad tech world is we do have working groups. Mostly the incentive is we're unregulated right now. We want to prove we can regulate ourselves so that they in DC don't regulate us. But with the political scandal that happened with like advertisements, they realized, oh my gosh, there's no regulation at all. So they actually agreed to put like a symbol in the corner of all political ads where you can, people don't click it because it's an ad, so it's flawed. But the idea is a user can click on that icon to not go to the website it's trying to direct you to, but get information about who paid for it and why you're being shown that ad. So is it because of my demographics? Is it because of my online behavior data and all that? So I think if that concept could be taken to other things like tagging content or tagging news links with how did this come to be, who's funding it, who's behind it, that would be interesting.
Yeah, and you're bringing up such a good point. Advertising world is such a huge, huge part of this because so much of when we talk about brand user safety, it also means brand safety. And we run into issues all the time where you've got an advertiser, and you're using political as an example, but there's also advertisements where Disney doesn't want their ad next to pornographic art on Tumblr. Like that's like a huge, huge issue, but it's also tough because we're really protective of the art community, and that is a form of expression, especially for like many of our users. But we struggle because that doesn't line up necessarily always with the advertising community. And it would be interesting. You're also making me think like they're almost like the sort of that other player in this conversation. because they're really driving. We talk about community guidelines, and certainly a lot of that comes from our users, but a lot of that comes from what are advertisers going to feel comfortable with too. And they're often very conservative, I think, in what they're actually comfortable with. And the political conversation, I think, brought some of that to light, but it's good to know. It makes me too want to talk to our advertising folks to just see if there are other ways that we can work with them, because they feel like a really crucial part of this conversation, because they could ultimately drive actually a lot of the change, I think. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Building on those 2 points and coming from the perspective of Tumblr, well, trying to come from the perspective of Tumblr, I think the 3 main priorities are to insulate the firm from any legal backlash. Second, to educate and spread awareness while restricting the use of Tumblr as a platform for hate speech. And third, to provide for a sustainable business model, because you can't hire unlimited moderators. As such, just throwing out an idea to build on both of them actually. Perhaps you could nominate or appoint user moderators on the platform to follow, however, a standard operating procedure, because many of the hot topics are often in the same mold, whether we are talking about abortion, pornography, etc. So if there's a standard operating procedure whereby these nominated user moderators can actually spread links to, how do you call it, credible websites with objective information that have already been vetted, there's gonna be a list. Why it's a standard operating procedure is because this list of issues is very much the same thing over and over again. The same debates and issues get rehashed over and over again. So if these user moderators can then spread these links, spread this information, perhaps mark a sign of credibility. You know, some forums have this like vetted user thing, or like
like a verified user.
Yeah, verified user. Yeah. So the thing is, this provides, you don't have to hire the moderator. The legal team will probably have to rationalize it by saying that if the moderator screws up, it's actually their fault, or somehow, some way. But this also ties into the industrial standard idea, because I'm sure these SOPs can be adopted in different social media platforms and copied.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We had been exploring a user advisory council in some way, like having them potentially do this, but I had never thought about them actually flagging some of that, like proactively engaging and sort of pushing back on disinformation. It'd be interesting to think about how we would ask them to do that. This is a place that I don't know that that a lot of places haven't explored. That would be a really interesting test case just to see how it goes, especially for these platforms. I think in the case of Tumblr, it'd actually be a little bit easier for us because we have so many users who are so passionate about Tumblr. Like when I meet a Tumblr user, it's like, oh yeah, like here's what I found on Tumblr, here's what my Tumblr was at 13 and here's what it was at 23. It's not quite the same as when you talk about people on Facebook. Like Facebook is now more of a utility. No one's necessarily like, oh my God, let me tell you about this great experience I had on Facebook, on my Facebook feed or whatever. It's just a very different, it makes you wonder if we could test out, we might be in a little bit of a better position to kind of test that out just because our users are sort of active. Really like that. Yeah.
I don't know. Sometimes I think I'm like trending toward an Orwellian nightmare whenever I like come up with certain scenarios. I've been like toying with the idea of like, I wonder if there's a way to kind of like, I think this sort of touches on what you were saying, like register news outlets, like actual news organizations with these platforms, and like you have to go through some kind of application process if you're a news organization to register with these platforms, and like you can only post content from those platforms then. And it like, you know, I'm not saying it needs to all be like liberal or like you know, straight like the Associated Press, but you know, if maybe something like that would eliminate at least like the completely made up content that's meant to look like real news. You know, the stuff that the Macedonian teens were turning out that isn't actually, it looked like a real news page, but it wasn't. But yeah, I think, you know, obviously people would be able to really pick apart that application process and be like, oh, tech companies are biased and they're only taking liberal news organizations. Also, like more news organizations are liberal, so you'd end up with more liberal news organizations. But I don't know. Just as and like that doesn't also take into account like the fact that a lot of fake news is actually like a meme. It's not necessarily a news article that's total garbage. It's, you know, what people just design.
Right.
That's, you know, like a dog whistle or like just, you know, overtly racist.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't have any good ideas.
Can I tell you
I
something?
talked myself out of that. As
No.
I was, like,
It's interesting you say that, because I also, when I go down that train, I'm like, get very negative. But the other thing that I am so, because we're just talking about, you're talking about news articles, but if y'all seen this technology that actually, like, I think this technology would allow me to not only do a video of you, but also actually record your voice and make you say things, make it sound just like you, and you're saying things that you never actually said. I think they did this for like a Barack Obama video or something. That stuff scares me, because the technology to create fake news and disinformation is wildly more sophisticated than the technology used to combat it right now. Like that, the unevenness that's the part that scares me, I think, the most, because we just don't have this. And I think then I go back to transparency, this idea of being super transparent, kind of like with ads, that advertising idea, but where you have to say, like, here's where this ad came from, like, or here's where this came from. But then it has to go back to, I think, some of this really aggressive digital literacy conversation. And someone called it like digital etiquette, and then Dana Boyd over at Microsoft called it like digital wisdom, is this idea of like really creating. But I still think, despite all of that, like, it will be really challenging to combat, because what you're talking about is, you know, I'm imagining the feeds, and that's the folks that, I think it's the Center for Media Literacy. I never thought about this, but he was talking about how now people only get their news from the Facebook feed, so they don't differentiate between what their friends are saying and what the Washington Post is saying. Like, it's just all one feed, and that's how they absorb it. And I just think that part is a scary thing. So I'm not making you feel any better, because I feel the same way. But I saw, yeah, you in the back.
Yeah, so two things. Well, I don't think your idea is actually that bad.
Thanks.
Or bad at all, with some context. Like, if it's about saying who gets to participate or not, that can be problematic. It's probably difficult to implement. Like you said, also, it's easy to attack, like, oh, you're gonna only let liberal outlets come in or whatever. But as an exercise in transparency, which is what she was getting at, may be valuable to know. Who are these organizations? I mean, the purpose is not to say you get to come in, you don't get to come in. It's rather who's here, where they are, how can you reach out to them. Things like labels saying like, this is sourced from here, this is sourced from there. You do see platforms like Facebook and Google are trying something similar to that with ads too. Like if you, for example, have a nonprofit try to get a Facebook page, they will ask you, are you going to engage in political ads? And they even send you, I think, a document home when you have to input a PIN, because they're trying to corroborate your identity. So I don't think your idea is, it's a good idea. Well, with the correct context, I mean.
Yeah, I think people would have a problem with like, okay, so Facebook is deciding what's news. That's like,
yeah,
that's an issue.
How often
That's
has
the
false
other.
things been reported in like mainstream news sources too?
How often is what?
False things also been propagated.
That's disinformation is nothing new, right? Just calling it fake news is what's kind of new about it.
But there's like, you know, there's still like the basic editorial infrastructure. There's a basic process of verification with real news that doesn't exist with like the completely made up stuff. So I don't want to like equate the two.
Sometimes like I'm talking as a user, and I feel like even the liberal news medias, they've become populist. Even if it's liberal news, it's the popular news that comes into because I read a lot of news sources, starting from Al Jazeera to Nate Silverman to NPR, anything. Sometimes I feel like on other sources, what is the top news, it's not on the NPR, because they do add some bias to it. Like, oh, this is, if I promote this news, even if it's liberal news, people will read more. So I feel like as a user, I feel like everybody is biased now. So I decide, which makes my life harder because I have to go to multiple different sources.
Yeah.
And if that is that Facebook decides what would be or whoever Twitter or Facebook decide what's the source of news, I wouldn't probably.
Yeah, well, like what if it's a new outlet and it's like, you know, it might be the next Huffington Post, but you know, because it's new, it can't, you know,
Actually get its foot in the
verify
door.
with
Yeah.
these tech companies and then like it can't get any traction, it can't get off the ground. So that's another huge problem. It's
Well, it
bad.
makes you, I know, it is. It's like, you're getting at the fact that this is like an incredibly like thorny problem. But I feel like we gotta start somewhere, right? Like you mentioned like, there are definitely platforms that are really playing around with certain things. But at the end of the day, like you're going back to something where you're gonna have to take some responsibility. And maybe some of this is teaching, like getting back to, I feel like we all had those classes where you understood what it meant to be a journalist. I think a lot of kids at some point like aspired to be reporters and you sort of understood what that meant to be a reporter, what that meant to be a journalist. And I'm not sure this generation totally feels the same way or had that, like put press and journalism in that same space as maybe that would actually make them sort of think how that's actually, how that news becomes, how a reporter actually goes about verifying sources and how many great links they have to go to and phone calls to verify all that. I'm not sure it makes me think you got to almost work with the journalism industry to actually shed some light on that process again, because I don't think this upcoming generation probably looks at journalism or knows as much about it as maybe those of us who were raised more with like we're just newspapers and that kind of thing. Yeah.
I think there's also the challenge of educating older generations though, because I think it makes so much sense to introduce this type of thing into schools from a young age so that the next generation will become tech literate. But then often what you see is there are older generations, like my mom will see something and be like, this is absolutely true, I saw it on the internet, and I'm like, oh no. But how do we reach those folks where there isn't a formal institution where we can introduce new curriculum to them?
Yeah.
I think that's really troubling, and that's something I just have a big question mark on.
No, I think that's right. I haven't seen a lot out there. It makes me wonder if, and this isn't going to be the case across the board, but I don't know if you felt this way, but like we have had to, I think I'm one of four, and all of us at one point have had to teach our mom, like not to fly off the handle at every Facebook thing that she sees that distresses her. But I think it's interesting. I wonder if there's like, it's almost within this, the child teaching the parent in some ways. I think there are other ways that we need to think about how to market this. Like this needs to be like across the board society, but I feel like children often can play a role in sort of playing some of that role. Yeah.
I was talking to a couple people over the break about this, but it's almost like building a spam filter, like understanding how credulous or how authentic something is. And part of the challenge is that we don't really have a way to measure it. And in advertising and other platforms, there's a lot of ways you can measure user behavior and user engagement, but it's really hard to know what is happening. And I was thinking a lot of the impacts of fake news and misinformation is that it incites some sort of reaction afterwards. So I'm also thinking about like a disclosure kind of thing to know, like when you're sitting down and reading this piece of information, it was designed to elicit this kind of response from you. And I know it can potentially really be dangerous as well, but we're saying that, when you sit down and see a commercial or watch a movie, you're prepared to be told a story. But when you read the news, our media literacy so far has kind of primed us to think like, okay, we're about to hear the biased fact. But if there's some sort of metric or way to show like the story was designed to take, like it's gonna paint this Cinderella story and there's gonna be a hero afterwards, and you're gonna feel like elated afterwards. I wonder if being told that can kind of take away some of the manipulative power of fake news.
Yeah, but I feel like it feels like there is, the technology may be far from that, and I wonder if you'd probably have to be super transparent, but I have to think that there's something there that we, between data on like what is actually already out there, collecting that, and the way that I am impressed, even though it's not perfect, I am impressed with the ability to train classifiers and train some of those filters, that you have to think that it could be pointed at this as well. It might be a slippery slope too, but it's definitely worth exploring. Does anybody else? Yeah.
I was going to say, like, I think a common theme is like about like differentiators and like using community standards as like market differentiators rather than asking Facebook as this sort of like monolith, quasi-monopoly to regulate everything. I think outside of tech, the more natural habit is to like read multiple news sources and like come up with a judgment on your own. And so I think part of it is like allowing like different internet or platforms to come up with their own community standards that sort of differentiates them in the market and allows like, I'm only letting my kid go to platform X because it has like the most strict community standards, and I get my news from platform Y, and I get my like memes from platform A, and it becomes this like marketplace of information with like different community standards rather than asking like the sort of like giants that be to like bring down a community standard for everyone.
Right. I think where it gets, so two things. One, I think you're getting at a really interesting point. And there's one other guy I want to mention that's worth looking at if y'all are really interested in this topic. He's actually here in Boston, but his name is Tarleton Gillespie. And he recently released a book this year, which I thought was such a great title, but it's called Custodians of the Internet. And he sort of talks about this a little bit, this idea that like, once you're a platform for certain things, you should own that. And that, like, that's who you are. Mm. Where it gets challenging is still, despite the fact that like even if you own a certain category or maybe being safe for children, it is still really, like, users are really clever in their ability to essentially, get around the rules, create their own sort of, underground campaigns around certain things, and I think it still gets at a really difficult. I think you're describing something that I hope we eventually move to, and I think that's where we'll get to. But before then, I think what is difficult is there's still no really sort of sound and safe way without getting highly prescriptive and just using automation on everything and just warning people like, hey, we're going to take, this is the platform that we're going to be super safe for kids. So breastfeeding pictures not allowed, napalm girl not allowed, like all of those things, anything that sort of, and I think that part is where it gets really difficult, is there's no real perfect combination right now that allows us to create those perfect platforms. But hopefully we'll get there. So I know we're almost running out of time, but I'll take one last comment, and this is so helpful.
Yeah, it's just a comment that also, I think we have to recognize the fact that part of it is subjective. Let's talk about arts or books, like what's reasonable to me might not be reasonable to you in sorts of what's portrayed, right? For example, the napalm girl, I saw that picture when I was 10 years old, and it was fine for me because that's how my parents explained this is the horror of war. That's how it's explained, but now a lot of people think that's not kosher for the students or children, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you manage that subjective perspective, right?
Yeah.
I don't think I'm a bad person because I saw that picture,
right?
But it made me face reality because my country went through a genocide too. I was not born then, but it helps me. Then I saw other pictures and everything. So it's also raising awareness about fact, history, and not shielding people, but also in the name of art. Lolita, how many of us read the book Lolita by Nabokov? But I think when I think about it now, it's like a creepy book to me. There's so many examples, right? Or Nabokov is as an author, he's like world-class author. We respect him, but he wrote Lolita, right? So it's all subjective matter, right? So how do we manage that? That's also like, by rules, can we actually manage those things?
You also make me think too, we could learn a lot from communities that have really lived some of this and know what it means for this content to be in the world and actually be a discussion point, a launch pad for like really opening the world's eyes to whether we're talking about genocide. You're making me think there are a lot of these communities that could probably teach us a lot about this conversation.
I agree that it's hard, like for parents, it would be hard to create like a uniform standard in a platform that every parent would be comfortable with because parents are different and what they teach their kids is different. But like, what if you borrowed from like TV and you have like parental controls that every parent can select for themselves, and they can say, I don't want my kid to see any violence. or like any nudity. And then there are other variations on that, like breastfeeding's okay, historical violence, if it's an imagery or like an article, that's okay.
Yeah,
Something like
and then
that.
this was where, this is, I think this is where the technology has to catch up. We have something on Tumblr where it's safe mode. So if you now sign up for Tumblr now, a lot of that content, not napalm girl, not breastfeeding pictures, but when it gets into especially adult explicit content, then it's sort of hidden, and it's one version of this. It's not perfect, and I don't really love the idea of us hiding things from users. I think that's been one of the concerns around content moderation, is that a lot of times you can turn on these parental controls, but there's not always a lot of transparency around what they're hiding from you exactly, because then it could get into what else could they hide from you? Like that isn't, what are they putting on your feed that maybe you don't you don't know where it's coming from? But I think it's an interesting idea and it kind of relates to what you were saying, like if you could create a platform that's like actually safe for kids and sort of sanitized for them, what would some of the technology look like? And that's the part that I think is a little bit challenging right now. But I think would be ideal is if parents could have a bit more control. There's been attempts, but I still think it's not quite perfect. Sorry, I'll take it maybe last two, and then we can keep talking. I just want to we're like a little over time, but we'll do the last two, and then I can hang out after.
I was curious because I love Tumblr, but I've also heard a lot of critiques of Tumblr as coddling social justice warriors.
Yeah.
That is now a huge point of discussion on college campuses.
Yeah.
So the worry of over sheltering maybe and creating too many conflicting versions of reality.
Yeah, sensitive. I worry about that all the time, especially because that's the community that I'm largely charged with trying to be a liaison for. I think we've largely, for the most part, have seen that be a productive thing, and I think people have been expanded their minds as a result of their experiences and the years that they spent on Tumblr. But it's still a concern. But I kind of have that concern overall for millennials and Gen Z. Period. I think they're just more of a reflection of privileged kids who are able to sort of have some of these views, and some maybe don't always go about pushing out those values or giving themselves a platform or giving activism a platform. It's definitely a concern of mine, but I feel like Tumblr is a little bit more of a reflection of sort of this bigger issue, period, and we just tend to be the front lines of activists, if that makes sense. So I watch it, but I feel like it's hard for us to totally figure out how we would police that.
I just wanted to mention really quickly that there's an organization called Common Sense Media, and they're basically trying to create a rating system for parents in the way we have for movies and TV, but expanding the content that's under the scope of it. So they're interesting. I don't know how effective they are, but they're kind of
trying to start that work. Cool. Thank you all so much. I hope this was time well spent for you because I definitely learned a ton. I know we didn't land with perfect solutions, but I feel like it's a start. I'll be spending some more time. I'm back in December here. I'm here some of the day tomorrow, but if any of you are working on things or you've got more ideas or you have thoughts in the next 24 hours that you're excited about, I would love to keep the conversation going. My email is victoria@tumblr.com, so I'd love to keep talking, and I'll let you know where we sort of land, and hopefully we can take some of this and turn it into some actionable things for Tumblr and then for just the industry, period. So thank you very much.